In the summer of 1942, the world watched as Hitler's unstoppable war machine rolled eastward. After conquering vast stretches of Europe, the Nazi juggernaut now set its sights on one city, Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, a name that Hitler swore to erase from the map. The German army advanced like a steel wave, confident, ruthless, and relentless. The streets of Stalingrad were not just a battleground, they were a symbol. For Hitler, it was personal. To destroy Stalin's city meant to crush Soviet pride. For Stalin, defending it was an act of survival and defiance. As the days grew longer, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, rained destruction upon Stalingrad. Entire districts were reduced to ashes. Black smoke blanketed the sky as civilians fled into basements and soldiers dug trenches among the ruins. But despite the chaos, the Soviet resistance refused to die. The city became a living hell, burning, screaming, breaking, yet still fighting. By late August 1942, German tanks reached the Volga River. Their mission was clear: capture Stalingrad at all costs. But the cost was unimaginable. In the ruins of shattered buildings, Soviet snipers lurked like ghosts. Every corner, every pile of rubble could hide death. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, brutal, close-quarters nightmare where men fought room to room, floor to floor. Meanwhile, Stalin's order echoed through the ranks: not one step back. Retreat was treason. Every soldier knew that surrender was not an option. Even the wounded were handed rifles. Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a fortress built from human will. As the Volga froze and the first snow fell, both sides realized this was no ordinary battle. It was a war of attrition, a test of endurance, a descent into madness. German confidence began to waver. Supplies ran low. The freezing Russian winter crept in, silent, merciless. And yet, deep inside the ruins, the Soviet defenders held their ground. Their city was dying, but their spirit refused to break. The Battle of Stalingrad had begun, a conflict that would change the course of history forever. A struggle so fierce, so desperate, that it would be remembered as the bloodiest battle ever fought by humankind. This was not just a fight for territory, it was a fight for survival, for vengeance, for destiny itself. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, a grim truth emerged: no one would leave Stalingrad unscarred. The city had become what history would forever call hell on earth. By September 1942, Stalingrad had become a graveyard of steel and fire. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, pressed deep into the city's heart. What began as a swift conquest now turned into a nightmare, a battle fought not for miles, but for meters. The once thriving industrial center of Stalingrad was now unrecognizable. Smoke rose from shattered factories, glass crunched under every boot, and the air was thick with ash and death. From dawn to dusk, artillery thundered without mercy. German soldiers advanced through debris-strewn streets, fighting for every building, every stairwell, every room. The Soviets responded with equal fury, ambushing, sniping, and counterattacking with a vengeance born from desperation. In the ruins of the Red October factory, Soviet workers who once forged steel now fired rifles. Teenagers, miners, and women joined the ranks, all determined to defend their home. The city was no longer held by an army, but by a people. Every house became a fortress, every basement, a bunker, every street, a battlefield. The fighting was so close that German and Soviet troops could hear each other breathe through the walls. Grenades rolled across floors. Bayonets flashed in the darkness. No front lines existed, only chaos. As the German divisions pushed forward, their confidence began to crack. The Soviets, though outgunned, seemed endless. Reinforcements poured across the Volga under constant bombardment. Barges loaded with fresh troops crossed the freezing river. Many never made it to shore. Still, the Red Army came, wave after wave, clinging to life, to hope, to the belief that Stalingrad must not fall. General Chukov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, issued orders with one unbreakable rule: hold Stalingrad or die here. His men obeyed without question. For them, death was preferable to defeat. The Germans, exhausted and bleeding, began to sense the trap closing in. Paulus believed victory was near, but the Soviet command had other plans. Deep behind the front lines, Stalin's generals, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, prepared a counterstrike that would shatter Hitler's ambitions. But for now, in the cold and rubble, men on both sides fought like beasts for survival. By night, flares lit the sky like ghostly stars. Shadows danced among burning ruins. The city groaned under the weight of endless war. Thousands perished each day, yet the fighting never ceased. The river ran red. The air reeked of smoke and blood. Hell, one German soldier wrote in his diary, has found its home in Stalingrad. The world watched in disbelief as the greatest army on earth found itself drowning in the ashes of one city. And still, the worst was yet to come. By late October 1942, Stalingrad was a city of ghosts. Smoke hung over the ruins like a shroud, and the cries of the wounded echoed through shattered walls. But beneath the chaos, the Soviet command was preparing a move that would change the war forever. For months, the German Sixth Army had fought house by house, convinced that victory was only days away. General Paulus reported to Hitler that Stalingrad was nearly captured. But what Paulus didn't see or refused to see was that his army was overextended, bleeding, and dangerously exposed. The Soviets, under the brilliant planning of Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, were quietly massing forces north and south of the city. Entire tank armies hidden by fog, forests, and deception waited for the signal to strike. The Germans believed their flanks were secure, guarded by their Romanian and Hungarian allies. But those units were under-equipped, under-trained, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. Inside the city, Soviet commander Vasily Chukov held on by the edge of his fingernails. His soldiers, half-starved and exhausted, fought for every inch of ground. They didn't know it yet, but help was on the way. "We will hold out," Chukov told his men, "until the order comes. Then we will strike like thunder." On November 19, 1942, at 7:20 a.m., the silence broke. Over 1,000 Soviet guns roared in unison. The earth shook as artillery shells rained down on the frozen steppes. Operation Uranus had begun. The Red Army launched a massive counter-offensive from both sides of Stalingrad, slicing through the weak Axis flanks like a blade through ice. Romanian lines collapsed within hours. German positions fell into panic. Tanks, horses, and men were swallowed by snow and fire. Within 3 days, the Soviet pincers had closed behind the German Sixth Army, trapping over 300,000 Axis soldiers inside Stalingrad. It was a masterpiece of strategy, one that stunned the world. For the first time, Hitler's invincible army was not advancing. It was surrounded. Inside the city, Paulus's men were now the hunted. Supplies dwindled. Temperatures dropped below -30, and every street became a frozen tomb. The Luftwaffe tried to airdrop food and ammunition, but most of it never reached the ground. The German soldiers began to starve. Their uniforms froze stiff, their weapons jammed in the cold. And still, Hitler refused to allow retreat. He commanded Paulus, "Hold your positions, not a step backward. Stalingrad must be taken or destroyed." But the tide had turned. What began as Hitler's dream of conquest was now becoming his greatest disaster. And as the noose tightened around Stalingrad, the frozen earth would soon claim the pride of the German army. The hunter, as one Soviet soldier said, had become the prey. Army was trapped, encircled inside a frozen wasteland of ruin and death. What had begun as Hitler's grand conquest had turned into a nightmare that even his generals could not escape. The snow never stopped falling. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, thousands of German soldiers shivered in bombed-out buildings, using broken doors for firewood and empty helmets to melt snow for water. Food was gone. Medicine was gone. Hope was gone. Frostbite turned fingers black. Wounded men lay in cellars, begging for morphine that would never come. The moans of the dying became the city's only music. General Paulus radioed Berlin again and again, pleading for permission to break out to escape the trap before it was too late. But Hitler's reply was cold and absolute. "Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will stand fast," He promised that relief would come. He promised that supplies would be flown in by air. But the skies above Stalingrad were no longer Germany's domain. Soviet fighters tore through the Luftwaffe's transports like wolves among lambs. Of the thousands of tons of supplies needed each day, only a fraction ever arrived. The Sixth Army was starving to death in slow motion. Meanwhile, outside the city, the Soviet armies closed in. They built rings of steel and artillery around Stalingrad, determined that no German soldier would leave alive. Operation Saturn, a second Soviet offensive, crushed the last hope of relief. Field Marshal Manstein's rescue force, the so-called Winter Storm, never reached the trapped men. By Christmas, the Sixth Army was completely cut off. Inside Stalingrad, soldiers huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers that no one would answer. Their Christmas meal was a slice of frozen bread and a spoonful of horsemeat. Letters home grew darker, written by men who already knew their fate. "We are lost," one soldier wrote, "but we will die like soldiers of the fatherland." The Soviets, too, paid a terrible price. Thousands fell in the snow, frozen corpses locked in eternal battle. But for the Red Army, every sacrifice brought them closer to victory. The defenders who had once fought for survival now fought for revenge. By the end of December, the Sixth Army was no longer an army, it was a graveyard. Out of 300,000 men, fewer than half could still fight. The rest lay buried under the snow, their faces turned toward a sky that had abandoned them. And yet, even in defeat, Paulus refused to surrender. He obeyed his Führer's command, a loyalty that would doom them all. By January 1943, the once proud German Sixth Army was broken, trapped, starving, and frozen. Its soldiers no longer fought for victory, they fought merely to see another sunrise. The city was silent now. No tanks rumbled, no engines roared. Only the crackle of distant gunfire and the moan of the wind through shattered windows. Men who had once marched across Europe now scavenged for scraps in the ruins of Stalingrad. They burned books for warmth, boiled leather belts for food, and prayed to a god who no longer answered. General Paulus's army, once 300,000 strong, was reduced to a few pockets of resistance. Their weapons rusted in the cold. Their wounded lay dying without medicine. The men waited not for orders, but for the end. In the Kremlin, Stalin watched with grim satisfaction. His gamble had worked. Stalingrad, the city that bore his name, had withstood the fury of the German war machine. Now, it would become the grave of Hitler's ambition. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets launched their final assault operation Ring. Over 7,000 artillery guns thundered in unison, shaking the frozen earth. The sky glowed red as shells rained upon the encircled Germans. What remained of Paulus's divisions collapsed under the storm. Streets vanished beneath fire and smoke. Bunkers were buried. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Paulus, promoted to field marshal by Hitler, knew what that meant. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler's message was clear: you will fight to the last man or die. But Paulus refused to be a martyr for madness. On January 31 Street, 1943, surrounded by Soviet troops, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of Stalingrad. 2 days later, the northern sector fell. The battle was over. Of the 300,000 soldiers who had entered Stalingrad, fewer than 91,000 remained alive. They were marched through the snow hollow-eyed, frostbitten, barely human. Less than 6,000 of them would ever return home. The Soviet victory was absolute, but it came at a terrible price. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians had died in the defense of their city. Stalingrad was not just a victory, it was a wound that would never fully heal. The snow of Stalingrad, one survivor said, was red for months. The world would never forget what happened there. The battle had turned the tide of World War II. For the first time, Hitler's army had been defeated utterly, irrevocably. From that moment, the myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Stalingrad was not just a place of death. It was the place where the fate of humanity shifted, where courage rose from despair, and where the ashes of a burning city gave birth to hope. As the sun set over the ruins, a bitter wind swept across the Volga. The battle was over, but its ghosts would whisper through history, "Forever." When the guns fell silent over Stalingrad in February 1943, the world stood still. The city was nothing but a skeleton, a monument of rubble and ash, but out of that devastation rose the sound of victory, a victory that changed the course of the Second World War. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was more than a triumph. It was a resurrection. The Red Army, once thought broken and beaten, had destroyed the mightiest force Germany had ever sent to battle. The myth of Nazi invincibility had died on the banks of the Volga. News of the German defeat spread like wildfire across the world. People celebrated in London, in Washington, in every occupied land that still dared to dream of freedom. But in Berlin, the news struck like thunder. The Führer's face darkened. His pride had been shattered. His armies humiliated. From that day forward, Hitler's dream of world domination began to crumble. The aftermath was horrific. When Soviet troops walked the streets of Stalingrad, they found nothing but corpses, frozen in grotesque poses, scattered across the ruins. Dogs gnawed on the remains of fallen soldiers. Entire blocks were silent tombs, filled with the dead of both armies. The smell of decay lingered for months, carried by the winter wind. For the survivors, victory brought little comfort. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were buried where they fell, beneath the rubble they had defended. Civilians emerged from basements, pale and hollow, searching for loved ones who would never return. The city had won, but it no longer lived. In the years to come, Stalingrad became a symbol of unbreakable will, a word that meant sacrifice, endurance, and redemption. The world began to understand what the Soviet people had endured: the starvation, the cold, the endless bombardment. Their victory was not just over the enemy, it was over despair itself. For the Germans, Stalingrad became a shadow that would haunt every soldier who survived. In Soviet captivity, they faced starvation, disease, and endless interrogation. Only a handful ever returned to Germany, broken, aged, and haunted by memories of fire and ice. For them, Stalingrad was not just a battlefield, it was a scar burned into their souls. Stalingrad, one German officer wrote years later, was the place where we lost not only the war, but our faith in ourselves. And yet, even amid the horror, there was something transcendent: the spirit of those who refused to give in. The ruins of Stalingrad became sacred ground, a symbol that even in the darkest hour, humanity could rise again. As the snow melted and spring returned, the Volga River flowed once more calm, silent, and red with memory. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. From the ashes of Stalingrad, the march to Berlin had begun. In the ashes of Stalingrad, there were no victors, only survivors. The city that had endured the greatest battle in human history lay in ruins, but it refused to die. From its shattered heart, a story of rebirth began. After the final guns went silent, the scale of devastation defied imagination. 9/10 of Stalingrad was destroyed. Factories turned to rubble, homes flattened, the Volga's banks littered with debris and bones. Yet, amid this wasteland, life began to stir again. Civilians who had survived months underground crawled back into daylight. Mothers searched for children. Soldiers searched for comrades. The cold air carried the scent of smoke, metal, and grief, but also something else: defiance. The Soviet government quickly declared Stalingrad a hero city. Trains began arriving with food, supplies, and workers. What had once been the front line of hell was now a construction site. Brick by brick, block by block, the people rebuilt their home even as memories of death surrounded them. For many, the rebuilding was not just labor, it was an act of mourning. Every shovel of earth uncovered a body, every wall raised stood upon bones. The people of Stalingrad knew that the ground itself was sacred, soaked with the blood of millions. "We build for the dead," one woman said, "so that the living may never forget." Across the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a legend, a word that inspired millions. Children in distant villages learned of the heroism of the defenders. Poets wrote verses about the city of steel. The world watched in awe as a city once reduced to dust began to rise from its own ashes. But not all scars could be rebuilt. For decades, survivors carried the trauma within them: the faces of the fallen, the cries in the night, the endless winter of 1942. Many could never speak of what they had seen. And yet, every year, the anniversary of victory, they gathered along the Volga, placing flowers where their friends had fallen, whispering prayers to the wind. The ruins of Stalingrad became monuments, silent witnesses to both horror and hope. The city was renamed Volgograd years later, but for millions, it would always remain Stalingrad, the city that would not die. Its story was more than war. It was about the human spirit, unyielding, unbreakable, eternal. Stalingrad had faced the fury of the greatest army on earth, and had survived. It had looked into the abyss and refused to fall. As the evening sun set over the rebuilt skyline, its light caught on the bronze of a towering statue. The motherland calls, her sword raised high, her face turned to the sky, a reminder that from the deepest suffering can rise the greatest strength. Stalingrad had burned, Stalingrad had bled, but Stalingrad lived. The Battle of Stalingrad did not end with the last gunshot. Its echoes would shape the destiny of nations, the course of the war, and the very soul of humanity. It was more than a victory, it was a symbol, carved in fire and iron. After Stalingrad, the balance of power in World War II shifted. The Red Army, once on the brink of annihilation, began to advance westward, village by village, city by city. From the Volga to Berlin, the Soviet war machine grew stronger with every mile. The Germans, who had once marched proudly across Europe, were now in retreat, their dream of domination shattered by the icy winds of the East. The psychological impact was enormous. In Berlin, despair replaced confidence. Hitler's aura of invincibility was gone. He had gambled everything at Stalingrad and lost. Inside his bunker, rage turned to paranoia. He began blaming his generals, his allies, even his own soldiers. But the truth was simple: Stalingrad had broken him. Across the world, people spoke of the city that stood firm against impossible odds. It became a rallying cry, a promise that tyranny could be defeated. In the Allied nations, newspapers hailed Stalingrad as the turning point of the war. For the oppressed people of Europe, it was proof that the Nazi war machine could bleed. Yet the cost was beyond comprehension. 2 million lives, soldiers and civilians, were lost in a single battle. The Volga's waters ran red. Entire families were wiped from existence. Stalingrad was victory born from the bones of the dead. Still, for the Soviet Union, it became a source of pride, a story told to every generation. Children grew up hearing the names of heroes: Pavlov, Chukov, Zaitsev, ordinary men who became legends. In classrooms and films, Stalingrad was portrayed not just as a military triumph, but as a spiritual one. Proof of the people's unity, courage, and sacrifice. But history's truth is never simple. Behind the victory lay unimaginable suffering, starvation, executions, and despair. Stalin used Stalingrad as propaganda, but for those who lived through it, no speech could capture the reality of that hell. They knew what it meant to fight, not for glory, but to simply stay alive. Even decades later, historians would struggle to understand how human beings endured such horror and still found the strength to rebuild. Stalingrad became a lesson for the ages, that war destroys everything it touches, yet somehow reveals the deepest strength of the human soul. In that city, one veteran said, "We saw both the worst and the best of mankind." As the guns of Stalingrad fell silent, the world moved toward its next great battles: Kursk, Normandy, Berlin. But nothing would ever equal the fury, the suffering, or the endurance of that frozen inferno. Stalingrad had changed the war, and the war had changed the world. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the ruins of Stalingrad still smoldered. Though the battle had ended years before, its shadow stretched across the world, a constant reminder of the price of power and the cost of survival. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, and Stalingrad became its proudest symbol. In every speech, in every parade, the name echoed proof of Soviet courage, endurance, and sacrifice. The city that had been reduced to rubble was now the heart of a new global power. But the truth beneath the propaganda was far more human and far more painful. For the survivors, Stalingrad never truly ended. They carried the war within them in their scars. In their memories, in their nightmares, every sound of thunder reminded them of shellfire. Every cold winter night brought back the smell of smoke and death. The city was rebuilt, yes, but the people who lived through its destruction would never be the same. As the decades passed, Stalingrad became a legend, a story told to remind future generations of what humanity can endure and what it must never repeat. Monuments rose where soldiers had fallen. Children played where trenches once ran, and the Volga flowed quietly past, its waters now calm, but heavy with memory. During the Cold War, Stalingrad's legacy was used as a weapon of ideology. Soviet leaders pointed to it as proof of their nation's strength and moral superiority. In the West, historians studied the battle as a turning point, the moment when Nazi Germany began to fall. But beyond politics, beyond the flags and slogans, Stalingrad remained what it always was, a testament to the human spirit under impossible circumstances. Visitors who came to the rebuilt city in later years often spoke of a strange silence that hung over it. The new streets were wide and bright, but beneath them lay bones, millions of them. Every brick, every step, every gust of wind carried whispers from the past. The ghosts of Stalingrad never left. They simply waited, unseen, in the shadows of memory. For those who fought there, on both sides, the battle was more than history. It was the moment that defined their lives. Some found redemption in survival, others found only guilt, but all of them shared one truth. No one walked away from Stalingrad unchanged. "I was 19, one Soviet veteran recalled, and I grew old in those 200 days. Today, Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, stands tall once more, its skyline crowned by the great statue the motherland calls. Her sword still points toward the heavens, not in anger, but in warning. She stands as a reminder that the price of peace is eternal vigilance, and that even in the darkest hour, hope can endure." The city that once burned became a beacon. From its ashes rose a lesson that the world can never afford to forget. That humanity's greatest strength is not in destruction, but in the will to rise again. In the heart of modern Volgograd, a flame burns day and night, a flame that never sleeps, never fades, never forgets. It flickers gently in the cold wind, fed by the memory of those who gave everything so that the world could live on. This is the eternal flame of Stalingrad. It stands in silence beneath the great dome of the Hall of Military Glory, surrounded by walls engraved with thousands of names. Each name a story cut short, each letter a memory of courage and pain. Visitors enter quietly. The sound of footsteps echoes against marble. A lone guard marches past the flame, his boots clicking in perfect rhythm, the rhythm of remembrance. Here, time seems to stand still. The war may have ended more than 80 years ago, but its presence lingers in every breath, every shadow, every heartbeat. Outside, life moves on. Children laugh in playgrounds, buses hum through the rebuilt streets. But beneath the noise of daily life, Stalingrad whispers. Its ghosts speak through the river winds, through the cracks in old walls, through the faces of those who still remember. For historians, the Battle of Stalingrad remains one of the most studied, most brutal confrontations in human history, a clash that redefined modern warfare. For the people who lived it, it was something else entirely. A descent into hell, and a climb back toward humanity. The battle destroyed a city, but it built a nation's spirit. It shattered bodies, but strengthened souls. It revealed the very best and the very worst of what mankind can be. And in its aftermath, the world learned painfully that no ideology, no empire, no ambition is worth the loss of millions. Every November, when the snow begins to fall again on the Volga plains, veterans return fewer and fewer each year. They stand before the eternal flame, those glinting faintly in the winter light. They don't speak much. They don't need to. Their silence says everything. It speaks of hunger, of fear, brotherhood, of sacrifice, and of the eternal hope that such a war will never come again. "They died so we could live," whispers one old woman, laying a single red carnation at the flame. Her hand trembles, her eyes glisten. In that moment, The past and the present merge, bound by the unbroken thread of memory. The flame dances on, and as long as it burns, Stalingrad will never be forgotten. Its name will remain carved in history, not only as a place of death and destruction, but as a symbol of endurance, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. In the end, the narrator's voice fades softly. It was not the bombs, nor the bullets, nor the blood that defined Stalingrad. It was the will to rise again, and to remember. The camera slowly pans upward, from the flickering flame to the statue of the motherland calls, standing tall against the twilight sky. The final words echo through the silence. Stalingrad, hell on earth, but a light that still burns in the darkness. Time has a way of blurring the lines between memory and myth. The ruins of Stalingrad are long gone, yet their shadows still reach across the years, whispering to those willing to listen. 80 years after the battle, the story of Stalingrad is no longer just history. It has become a mirror that shows us what humanity can achieve when it stands together, and what it can destroy when hatred leads the way. Across the world, new generations study the maps, the photographs, the testimonies. They read of the freezing soldiers, the starving civilians, the desperate last stands in shattered factories. They ask, why did it happen? Could it happen again? And the silence of the past seems to answer, only if you forget. In museums, faded uniforms rest behind glass. Rusted helmets, torn letters, and cracked rifles lie still, relics of a war that devoured millions. Yet behind every object, there was a heartbeat once. Behind every statistic, a story. A young man who dreamed of going home. A mother who prayed through the night. A child who never saw another dawn. The soldiers of both sides fought for different flags, different beliefs, but in the end, they bled the same. Their pain, their courage, their sacrifice transcended borders and ideologies. That is the truest legacy of Stalingrad. That even in the depths of hell, the essence of humanity, compassion, endurance, hope can survive. Today, Volgograd stands as a living city. Its people walking on streets where once there were trenches. Glass towers rise where ruins once stood. The Volga flows as it always has, silent but eternal, carrying the memories downstream. And every February, the city falls silent once more. Sirens wail, and for 1 minute, the entire city stops to remember. In that silence, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the march of soldiers who never came home. You can feel the cold wind from 1943 brush your face, and you understand that remembrance is not about the past. It is a promise for the future. If we forget Stalingrad, a historian once said, we will lose more than history, we will lose ourselves. So the story must be told again and again, not to glorify war, but to warn against it, to remind us that peace is fragile, freedom is precious, and unity is the only victory worth fighting for. As the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice returns calm, steady, eternal. The world will change, generations will pass, but the lessons of Stalingrad will remain carved not in stone, but in the human soul. The music swells, a soft orchestra of sorrow and hope, as the final image fades into the flicker of the eternal flame. For those who fell, for those who lived, and for those who must never forget. History does not end when the guns fall silent. It echoes across borders, across generations, across the conscience of the world. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a military turning point. It was a moral reckoning. In the ashes of that city, humanity saw both its darkest and its brightest sides. The courage of ordinary people, the cruelty of ideology, the endurance of hope, all collided on those frozen streets by the Volga. When the Red Army raised its flag over the ruins, the world began to change. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. From that moment, the tide of war shifted westward toward Berlin, toward victory, toward the end. But the cost was unimaginable. Over 2 million live soldiers, civilians, children consumed in the fire of a single city. As Europe rebuilt itself, the ghost of Stalingrad hovered over every peace treaty and every border line. It shaped the Cold War, not as a memory of triumph, but as a warning of what unchecked power can do. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a sacred story, the proof of its destiny. For the rest of the world, it was a reminder that wars are not won by weapons alone, but by the will of people who refuse to surrender. Through the decades, its echoes reached beyond politics. Writers, filmmakers, and artists searched for meaning in the ruins. Each tried to capture the impossible, the human spirit that had survived the impossible. Some saw tragedy, some saw heroism, all found truth. The veterans of Stalingrad, now old and frail, became living monuments. Their memories kept the fire alive long after the city's smoke had faded. And when they spoke, their voices carried the weight of history itself. They did not glorify war. They mourned it. They spoke of hunger, of frostbite, of comrades who never came home. They spoke so that others might never have to live through what they endured. Today, Stalingrad's story belongs to everyone. In classrooms, its lessons are taught not as ancient history, but as a mirror of what still threatens humanity: tyranny, pride, and the illusion of invincibility. Because the greatest danger is not forgetting the past. It is believing that the past cannot return. The narrator's voice softens, almost like a whisper carried by the Volga wind. In every age, there is a Stalingrad, a place where humanity is tested, where the line between hope and despair is drawn. And each time, it is courage, not cruelty, that defines who we are. The screen fades to black and white stills, ruined buildings, faces of soldiers, the eternal flame, the river, the statue, the city reborn. Then, the final words appear in silence. Stalingrad, hell on earth, and proof that even in hell, the human spirit can rise. Time may heal the wounds of war, but the scars remain, carved deep into the soul of humanity. Stalingrad is one such scar, eternal and unforgettable. More than 8 decades have passed since the last shot echoed across the Volga, yet the battle continues to live. Not in fire and smoke, but in the stories of those who remember. In Volgograd, every stone and street holds a memory. Every generation grows up beneath the shadow of the motherland calls. The towering symbol of resilience that watches over the city like a silent guardian. School children visit the museums, tracing their fingers over rusted helmets and faded photographs. Veterans, now almost gone, are honored with tears and trembling hands. They are living links to a time when the world was burning. Reminders that peace is not inherited, it is earned. Across the world, military historians still call Stalingrad the bloodiest battle in human history. But for the people of Russia, it is not just a statistic, it is identity, sacrifice, and pride woven into their national memory. To them, Stalingrad is not a ruin, it is a resurrection. It represents the moment when despair turned to defiance, and defiance to victory. The city itself has changed. Modern Volgograd stands tall, its skyline lined with glass and steel. Yet at dawn, when the first light touches the Volga River, the mist seems to carry echoes from the past. You can almost see the silhouettes of soldiers in the fog, still standing guard, still whispering through time. In the West, Stalingrad is studied as a turning point, the moment that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. But beyond strategy and numbers, the story carries a deeper truth, that the will of ordinary people can shape the destiny of nations. In the rubble of Stalingrad, humanity rediscovered its strength. Every February, the city stops to remember. Sirens wail, flags lower, crowds gather before the eternal flame, their faces lit by its glow. And for one solemn minute, the world seems to hold its breath. The silence says what words cannot. They are not forgotten. The narrator's voice grows quiet, contemplative. History is not just about battles and borders. It's about people, their choices, their pain, their hope. The story of Stalingrad is not about war. It is about endurance. It is about the will to live when everything is lost. As the camera pans across the river, sunlight breaks through the clouds, shimmering over the rebuilt city. A new generation walks its streets free, unafraid, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet. And that is the true victory of Stalingrad. Not destruction, but rebirth. As long as we remember, the voice concludes, the legacy of Stalingrad will live on, not as a tale of death, but as a triumph of the human spirit. Some battles are remembered by nations, But Stalingrad is remembered by the world. When the war ended, the story of Stalingrad spread far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In the ruins of that frozen city, the entire world saw a reflection of both suffering and strength. For the first time in history, enemies and allies alike bowed their heads in respect. Not just for victory, but for endurance. In Britain, newspapers called it the turning point of humanity. In America, generals studied it for decades, the moment where courage defied all logic. And in Germany, it became a wound that shaped generations, a solemn reminder of the terrible price of blind ambition. From Europe to Asia, people who had never seen the Volga came to know its name. Stalingrad became a word written in blood, but also in hope, a lesson carved into the conscience of mankind. In France, the city of Paris renamed one of its major avenues Avenue de Stalingrad, honoring the courage of its defenders. In Britain, 1,000 children wrote letters to the Soviet soldiers, small hands, writing big words of gratitude. And in cities across the world, memorials rose, simple stones that whispered, "We remember." The narrator's voice deepens, filled with quiet awe. They were not fighting for glory, they were fighting for survival, and in doing so, they defended more than a city. They defended the idea of humanity itself. As the years passed, Stalingrad's legacy became a bridge between nations once divided by war. Western leaders visited Volgograd to lay wreaths at the eternal flame. Old veterans from both sides shook hands, their eyes wet with memories. They could not speak. The past did not disappear, but in those moments of remembrance, it found peace. Art and cinema carried the story forward. Films, paintings, novels all tried to capture the unbreakable spirit of the defenders, the agony of the civilians, and the unimaginable courage it took to hold a city against annihilation. And though each version told it differently, the message remained the same. Never again. In the modern world, where borders shift and tensions rise once more, the story of Stalingrad still stands like a silent warning. It tells us that hatred breeds nothing but ruin, that victory without humanity is no victory at all. As the narrator's voice softens, the scene fades to a black and white montage. Candles flickering in Moscow, wreaths laid in Berlin, flags lowered in London, children's faces, soldiers' names, the eternal flame burning quietly against the wind. The world remembers, the voice whispers, and as long as we remember, Stalingrad will never die. The camera pans out one last time, where the Volga River, endless and calm, carrying the memory of the fallen toward eternity. The ruins of Stalingrad are long gone, but their message still whispers through time, a message carved in stone, written in blood, and carried by the wind that drifts over the Volga River. It says, never again. Never again should cities become graves. Never again should innocent lives be buried beneath the ambitions of men. Never again should the world watch as hatred consumes humanity. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in victory, but not the kind that brings joy. It was a victory drenched in sorrow, a triumph born from suffering. The city was saved, but millions were lost. And yet, through that pain, the human spirit proved indestructible. Across the decades, the survivors have passed away, their voices fading like echoes in the snow. But the story they left behind remains eternal. It lives in museums, in classrooms, in the hearts of those who believe that remembrance is not about the past. It is about protecting the future. Every year, when the cold winds of February sweep across Volgograd, the eternal flame burns a little brighter. Children lay flowers, old veterans salute, their hands trembling, but their hearts strong. And for one silent moment, the entire city seems to breathe as one, united by memory. The narrator's voice lowers, heavy with reverence. The men and women of Stalingrad did not fight for glory. They fought for life, for the right to exist, for the hope that the world could be better than the one they knew. Today, the message of Stalingrad belongs to everyone, to every nation that has tasted war, to every generation that seeks peace. It reminds us that strength is not in conquest, but in compassion, that true victory is not in destruction, but in rebuilding what was lost, and that peace is not a gift, it is a responsibility. In a world still divided by fear and ambition, the story of Stalingrad stands as a monument to endurance, Proof that even in the darkest chapter of history, the light of humanity can survive. That flame, once born in the ashes of a burning city, still burns in the hearts of all who remember. The music swells soft strings, distant choir, echoing drums as the narrator delivers the final words. To forget Stalingrad is to forget ourselves. To remember it is to protect everything we hold dear. So let the flame burn forever. A promise, a warning, a hope that never again will the world know such hell on earth. The screen fades to black. Then, one final image, the eternal flame flickering against the night sky. The words appear slowly white on black. Stalingrad, hell on earth 1942 to forever.